In this episode of the Anti Library podcast, we are moving to Eastern and Central Africa in the early to mid 20th century. We are talking about vampires, but these vampires are not the undead Transylvanian aristocrats or French libertines of New Orleans. Rather, these are part of the widespread rumors throughout Kenya, Uganda, Zambia, and so on, often associated with government officials, doctors, firemen, or white colonial employers who were rumored to capture and drain the blood of African laborers, children, and travelers. The stolen blood of Africans were rumored to be used for magical purposes, to prolong the lives of white settlers, or to strengthen the processes of colonial exploitation itself. The historian Louis White, in Speaking with Vampires, delves into these stories of vampires that spread across Nairobi and Kampala, colonial Tanganyika, and colonial Rhodesia. Rather than imposing the European category of the vampire upon African categories of bloodsuckers, such as the Wazimamoto, Mumiani, which she discusses at length, she reveals the variability and the cultural mutations in the very idea of the vampire itself. Louis White's brilliant insight is to treat vampire rumors not as superstitions of colonized people, but as legitimate forms of historical evidence. The vampire were a personification of the opaque and brutal mechanisms of colonial power, the coercive labor practices, the sudden disappearances of people, the arbitrary medical procedures, and the state's seemingly supernatural ability to extract resources and life from the populace.
And we have the historian Louise White with us today. She is Professor Emerita at the University of Florida, whose research deftly moves across labor history, medical history, oral history, and military history. And she is the author of such seminal works as The Comforts of Home, Prostitution in Colonial Nairobi, which won the Herskovits Prize for the best book in African Studies in 1991. Speaking with Vampires, Rumor and History in Colonial Africa, that we will discuss today. The Assassination of Herbert Chitepo, Texts and Politics in Zimbabwe, Unpopular Sovereignty, Rhodesian Independence and African Decolonization, and most recently, Fighting and Writing, the Rhodesian Army at War and Post-War, published in 2021. Without further ado, let's go to Professor White.
So let's just start with your story. Basically, how did you come across the vampire stories or the rumors which you have worked with all through your life?
I was really pleased to read that because obviously I used to get asked this a lot. And I told the story so many times that, and this really relates to the book, I began to worry if it was true or not. In the way when you tell a story many times and you work on the details and you tweak, it basically becomes a performance. And I began to think, is this really what happened? Or is this the story I tell? So I'll tell you the story I tell, and then we can work it into my book. So my dissertation was about prostitution in Nairobi. I had a questionnaire. I asked a woman, I had a question really to see how much police presence there was in Nairobi. Were there gangs? And said, was there any place in the city where she was afraid to walk alone at night? And the woman said, I wasn't afraid of anything but the fire station roundabout because they captured people and sucked their blood. I heard this and this is, I said, oh shit, I came all this way, I got a crazy lady. One of the ways I learned to speak the pathetic Swahili I have was to go home and tell my research assistant's mother everything that happened. And I learned the word for lunatic, for crazy woman. And I told her this, and she said, no, that's true. The fire department did that from the fighting of the Germans, World War I, to the fighting of the Italians, World War II. And I thought, So I started just asking questions about it. Zimamoto is basically the people of the fire, but that's the word for the fire brigade. And then I just had a ton of material about it. And I sort of did things, and I didn't do things with it. And I can't remember. I was invited to a conference, and it was my last year in a temporary job, the last of my travel money. So I went to a conference at SAIS, at this white school, Johns Hopkins. There are a lot of Kenyans there. And I gave a paper on this. A friend later told me he was terrified that I'd be for presenting superstition and showing Africans to be superstitious. Instead, I was barely finished. And the head of the Department of Government at the University of Nairobi jumped up and said, where did you hear that? I never heard anyone but my mother tell those stories. And I thought, okay. So, and then again, just another lucky thing, you needed a research permit to do research in Kenya. I'd applied for one 2 years before. I'd forgotten about it. I get back from this conference and there's a letter saying, we've approved your permit. And then a handwritten note saying, oh, we realize you applied 2 years ago. Do you still want to come? And then just became, so I started doing more research on it. And then a couple years later, I found out there were these files in Zambia. And then everyone said, that Uganda was just the center of these rumors. Uganda. So I went to Uganda and I went to Zambia and I did a ton of research. But what I always tell graduate students, one thing leads to another, and just a lot of things led to another. And that's how I got into it. But again, this story, all of it is true. Actually, I haven't talked to anyone about this for years. So now it feels truer. But basically, as a story I've told many times, sometimes it feels more like a performance than a true story. And I've actually periodically wondered, is this really what happened? Is this what I remember? So, but again, that also came from thinking nonstop for years about what does it mean to tell a story? And what does it mean to remember? You don't need to be an oral historian to know that lies are much better stories than true stories. People work to make lies credible. I found myself wondering, is this a true story or is this a performance? And I think, the other thing is it doesn't matter. And the best way to explain it is an old man in Uganda. And he had really good English. And I was doing the interview myself and I was kind of hassling him. Why did he think these stories were true? He never knew anyone was abducted. I don't know what else I said. And finally he just got exasperated with me. And he said, nevertheless, they existed as stories. So there's a, I don't want to say concrete, because that's too concrete, but there's a way in which the practice of talking about them makes them true. And whether it's a story you crafted or just off the top of your head doesn't make it any more true or false. And I mean, I'm getting ahead here, but I mean, I argued this in the book and in several articles. Historians get obsessed with, is something true or false? Did it really happen? I don't dispute these are important questions. Whether or not something really happened, yeah, you should nail that. But that's not the most interesting question we could be asking. That's not the sum total of what we should be doing.
Yeah, that's a really great point. That leads me to the second question, which is, as you were saying, these stories kind of concretize as they're told. The performance and the veracity, they kind of get entangled when these stories are repeated by various people. So who are the specific people among whom you find these stories? Is there a specific social group that tend to talk about the vampires more than the others?
No, and I didn't find one. And I dare say, I mean, obviously educated elites don't tell the stories, or at least not to foreign researchers. But I had been in all sorts of situations in the mid-'80s in Kenya, like changing money at a rural bank where I only saw one other white person in 3 months. When I told the guy what I was doing, he was thrilled someone was getting to the bottom of this. The story, I'm not so sure the stories are constant.
Mhm.
I'm not so sure that you think every white person who walks by is going to suck your blood, or or every medical encounter is about taking your blood. I mean, that obviously there's specifics to it, but I didn't find any single group. The men I interviewed, who were usually men who had either been migrants in Nairobi or former railway workers in Western Kenya, partly because my then research assistant was the nephew of the third African ever to drive a locomotive. So we had to go village to village. But men told stories about the workplace. Do farmers tell other stories? Probably. Do women and men tell different stories? Yeah, but not so much that I got really, they tell different stories. So it's not like there's one group.
So I was fascinated by how you bring in specific African terms like Wazimamoto, and then there are all these different categories which are working alongside the more European or Western idea of the vampire. So could you tell us a little bit more about these different categories, how they interact, and the cultural context in which these categories operate?
Well, are you talking about my use of African terms or the concepts?
Yeah, more concepts behind those
Okay, so
terms.
I started, I've always argued for this. And in my history of prostitution, I used the African terms. I used the terms Africans used for labor forms. Don't get me started on provincializing Europe, but we don't need to use all these European terms. The generalization can come from Africa. And there's no, if you're going to use local knowledge, use local terms. But there's another reason here, which is when I started, I didn't want to say vampires. Vampires wasn't a European term, wasn't an African term. That's kind of a purity. You don't want to force an African category African categories into a European term. Vampires, however, turns out to have the most interesting history as a term, and there is no looser category on Earth. I started to use, first you think, oh God, I'll use, but I started to use it very, very cautiously. The first articles don't say vampires. I started to use it very cautiously, and then I thought, what the hell? But that you have to, and like every other African, you want to be read out. You want to be read more widely. You want this, you want this to make some kind of contribution. But these aren't, so these are not got people sleeping in their coffin. But vampires, there is no more racial category than vampires, in that they reproduce differently. They have different they have different lives. They are biologically different from living humans. So at one kind of misguided point, I thought of writing an article that would have two forms of evidence, that there would be evidence from my work and then evidence from the novel Dracula. But I didn't do that. So
That sounds like a fascinating plan.
for about an hour, it sounds that way.
Okay, great. So I'm also curious about your uh, research on and methodological use of rumor, which is, as you said, it's kind of ephemeral. It becomes concrete when people tell them. With each telling, it can have variables and so on. But at the same time, you were talking about entrenched historical patterns about which also we are interested. So the history of labor, or property relations in Nairobi, prostitution in Nairobi, and so on. So how do these two levels interact? You are not saying that you are writing a micro history, right? If I'm understanding your methodology
Although I've
correctly.
been told it is a microhistory.
Okay, okay.
I was writing this essay about microhistory in Africa, and I said, well, Africa, and then one of the editors kind of said, no, you wrote microhistory and you do know what it is and see these pages. So go ahead. I interrupted you.
Yeah, that's thanks for clarifying that. So my question generally is, how are you working with these different levels of historical evidence, the larger pattern, the specific things that happen in a specific city or a specific quarters of the city, and also the idea of these stories as rumors, which is much more ephemeral but can take concrete form. So
let me just break this down. First of all, rumors turn out to be much more interesting than anyone thinks. And there's an enormous amount of literature, both in social psychology. The people who study rumors most intensely are social psychologists, and they go to work for big companies because product rumors are an enormous thing. So there's who knew? I went to a conference on rumor. So that, but also journalists, because rumor doesn't, both the rise of American sociology and the professionalization of journalism, then the category of rumor as something distinct from news where you have checked many sources That is much more important. The social psychology research is absolutely horrific by today's standard. You start a rumor about someone in an apartment complex and trace it. But rumor, and I think Europeans, partly with just a very different history of literacy, have a very different take on rumor, that there's lots and lots and lots of words for information. And rumor is one of them. Official words is one of them. There are 5 others. I mean, African people have a lot of words depending on the time. Is it long ago? Is it not so long ago? There was wire times. That was like what you heard talking to someone on the barbed wire. And then there was office times. That was like what somebody overheard cleaning the commandant's office. Also, I read a bunch of folklore, and I cannot recommend reading folklore too highly, partly because it's so much fun and you always end up laughing at something. But I read a lot of folklore and urban legend stuff, and it wasn't very satisfying. So how to write about, and then classical anthropology, however, they gossip. They wrote about gossip. And they're a bit rigid. Gossip is always about reputation, or is anything anybody says about someone not present, that is ontologically gossip. So the literature on gossip from anthropology just changed my life. And there's a French anthropologist who wrote about witchcraft in some area of France. And I remember just falling off my chair. She has a line that says, when your informants want to gossip with you, they don't actually care about gossiping with you. They're trying to test how much you know. And I mean, I was always hearing gossip and kind of shying away. And that's not what's going on. So I just found the anthropological literature very rich. But I also backed down from the term rumor. Because, first of all, the classic definition of rumor is not that it's false, but the speed at which it spreads. And I would argue that's not an accident. Rumors work because people believe them. You hear that the firemen were out the other night and they sucked so-and-so's blood. You think, that sounds reasonable to me. Rumors work not because people want to believe them, but because they sound very reasonable. So I kind of tried to say stories more than rumor. And the other thing, there was a point where I realized I was saying idiom so much. I just kind of I banned myself from saying idiom. That there's all these ways. I mean, but it was a hard book to write and more fun than I can imagine. But I wanted to do it justice. I didn't want to I made jokes all the time. And I didn't want to trivialize it. But, I'm so proud that I didn't make the metaphors. They kind of rub up against metaphors, and they kind of, they're almost there, but they're not. And then I kept that tension. But the other thing, then let me just talk historiography. I think the hardest thing to tell apart, but also the most important, is what's the difference between a detail and an example. And then the local histories, which were, I think, absolutely, that the local history is something else. But can the same piece of evidence be used in different ways? We all know it can, but we don't do it all the time.
We are also curious to know that you have been working with different languages, but recently there's this idea that because it's sort of easier to access texts which are Anglophone or Francophone, especially where Africa is concerned. So do you think that these approaches can be limiting in such a way, or how important do you think knowing specific local languages in order to get to know cultures is?
I think that's really, really important. I also think it's really, really difficult. And I also think, we're scholars, we're not translators. The first time I wrote a national grant proposal for vampires, I came home and there was a message on my machine from my late friend, Ivan Karp, who was the director of ethnography. The message, I think this is a quote: "Louise, you claim to speak for the African voice so often, I can only assume you're going to publish in Daluo. You're a scholar, you are analyzing, get real. And I think that's really, really important. Local language is important. Local language is one of the things scholars beat themselves up over. I always work with a translator. I have decent enough Swahili. I was doing my own interviews sometimes in Nairobi with prostitutes. How many slang terms are there for sex? How many slang terms are there for boyfriend? Now multiply that over 20 years. And I would start out, and then they would start, they would start trying to fuck me over with the words. And I would try to keep up, and then I couldn't, and then they would fall apart. I mean, it's not language, it's nuance and context. I always work with a research assistant. I think you have to, just because, it's not, you have language, but can you translate the argument behind you on the bus? I also think language becomes this kind of other purity test. I mean, we're always in translation. Every time someone told me about rubber sucking tubes or bandages on your mouth or injections, that's also a translation. So the translation goes both ways. But one of the things that turned out to be really rich is these vampire stories are anecdotes in the memoirs of colonial officials. And they know you always use local terms, by the way. And they were so interesting. Partly, here are stories told by people who don't believe them. So, I mean, but there was this whole, I mean, not a zillion texts, but enough in English that were really interesting. But look, people should know local languages. They should know language. They should know culture. They should know a whole lot about the people they're studying. But that's not the end. That's the start. And if you're working like I was, and you're going to know maybe one. I worked in too many places, so to have any kind of decent language skills, but I do have a good research assistant. And a good research assistant isn't necessarily, someone who knows what you're about, but has some sense of what local idiom is.
And you talked about that also in the phone call, that you said that people have much more of a nuanced understanding of things like anecdotes or stories or rumors than people who are just talking about written texts.
Yeah, I mean, all orality and literacy makes me nuts. But people who don't read, who don't fall back on the written word as authority, have a lot of ways to talk about it, to kind of to do what linguists call it authoritative speech, and to suggest to tell exactly how much speech the authority has. And I think when it gets collapsed into rumor versus true, then you lose all that nuance of the variety of falsehood. Plus, we're not even talking about silences. The idea, we're sort of like every silence is the same.
And so this is a kind of more general question of having written this great book. How do you see the development of oral history? So both in the American context and among the Africanists, and in general, how do you see the trajectory that oral history has taken?
Okay, so a year after this book was published, the results of a conference a couple of years before was published as a book, co-edited collection, African Words, African Voices. And I think there's some great essays in there. And basically, I think we won. I mean, I haven't really been paying attention. I did a Zoom graduate seminar that was between Duke and UNC. There's a small graduate program. And it was like nothing in the vampire book struck them as odd. This wasn't a big deal. I mean, I think we won this round. And I think both the subject matter, again, South Asia is a little more open, but African history polices its subject matter. I think nothing I have to say about oral history is terribly interesting or new to any African historian. I said this, American oral history has reduced it to the interview. So rumors, jokes, stories. That's folklore. That should be in the anthropology department. But if you want to know something about someone's past, you interview them. And there's also an Italian, I think he's a lit crit person, Alejandro Portelli, who's written a lot of oral history. Hope he's not a close friend of yours. I mean, anything a poor person says is true, and nothing else you have to deal with. Rather, I mean, there are things that Africanists have done in the last probably now 20 years. That's kind of amazing. Okay, let me just backtrack here. Before me and my friends were doing this, the 1990s, the kind of the detritus of women's history, a new focus on the individual, all the rules for oral tradition that you have to check it by eclipse and double check and find the right ritual specialist, that got replaced by, I think I have this in the book, intense attention to the interview. That the person had to trust you. You had to positionality, all this kind, you had to sort of be aware that I'm a white woman and I'm talking to an old Black woman and blah, blah, blah. You had to do all this. And there's a bunch of work, some of it really conscious, some of it not. One of my very favorite articles in the world is about Rwandan dynastic politics. Nothing could be more boring, except he's interviewing someone and they tell him something about their heritage. And then he has to go back to clarify. And this time their ancestry is very different. Mm-hmm. And what's the difference? Who was walking by the second time? It has nothing to do with the interview. It has to do with the broader audience. And there's this great demystification. And again, folklorists would never hear a performance of a traditional ballad or ceremony without a local, without a person from the community there. I mean, that it becomes less of a performance. I think in terms, maybe there's an Americanist oral history that is branching out, but something like, Florida's oral history program, all these oral history programs at universities are cash cows. They're ways to kiss up to the legislature, and write their history, and I'm all for that, But basically, I'm not sure how far it's gone. I have to say, right before this, I just learned how to look at citations on Google Scholar. So I was looking at the citations for the vampire book. Yeah. I always wondered, and I went out and go, oh my God, so-and-so cited me. I was so excited. I do very well in the history of medicine. Not so, I didn't see anything from American oral history. I'll go back and check, but I think this is not, I mean, an Americanist. So yeah, I think American oral history is a real backwater.
You already mentioned this kind of like an intertwining between oral historians and storytelling, right? So if you have to pick a side, would you refer to yourself as an oral historian or a storyteller?
Oh, absolutely oral history. No, and I do this, and my first book, was really a reconstruction from oral history. And I really believe this, and I think, I'm not saying where it fails, but so much oral history is you have specific interests and you go somewhere to talk to people, either to get details or flesh it out. But basically, you're asking people to talk about what you're interested in. Obviously, I was interested in this. This was my project, but I felt like I was this was something people were talking about when I wasn't there. I'm not sure everybody's talking about a 1936 strike, without this. So I know very much oral history. Okay. And again, early oral history brought some anthropology into it, but then they threw it away.
Yeah, I see. I'm sorry, I'm asking another question after the last one. So I really find it fascinating how you, in terms of your work, and you talked about how the field changes a book or basically makes the book, and not what one goes with into the field, but what one discovers. So there is something uncertain or serendipitous about the field and so on. So could you talk a little bit more about, this is a clarification about you made a distinction between an example So where one has already made up the category and there is just one more example, and then there is some evidence that actually transforms the concept itself. So
I mean, that's something that happens in writing. So one thing, you can't go back and double check. It's oral history. I mean, I'm like everyone else who's ever done oral history. You reread your interviews and you go, where was I the first 5 times I read it? So I'm going to save myself weeks of work if I'd read this. This. Look, it's like reading anything else. You bring previous readings to it, but the detail and example kind of came from writing and how to structure that book. And I had originally had 3 long methodological chapters instead of a 50-page introduction. But basically, the question was how to write this. And you could break it down into all these local segments, which I felt really confident about doing. And that's what the articles are. There are a whole bunch of articles. I mean, I felt really confident about that. But what did that do to the stories? It made them very local. It made them kind of isolated. And it was kind of good. And I mean, could I write about them more broadly? Okay, is there a real difference between details and examples, or is it in syntax? Is it in how you use it? That came in writing. I mean, that never really thought about it. And when I came away, I think I had all the oral history I was going to do 9 years before the book was done. I made a couple other research trips, but it was written sources, it was mission accounts. And again, you can't do this with the dissertation. It has to be a later book. I got to live with that material for a long time. And that's, again, there are other constraints, but it's sort of like thinking about what it looks like, how it works together. But the structure of the book, I actually applied for a grant for the National Humanities Center, and they asked, I don't know. I at one point I said I was halfway done. It's absolute lie. And a friend read it and said, if you're going to say you're halfway done, you should make up a table of contents because no one will believe you otherwise. So I made up a table of contents, which was actually all local studies. But I was surprised how close I kept to it at the end, the Ugandan stuff. But the detail and example is about writing and how to tell the difference and how to write with the difference. And can we not make details examples? Can details help us understand the story, but maybe not prove what we think we're proving?
Okay, yeah, there is a lot of mythological lesson there. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. This is fun.